We've just seen that if one were to describe the type of eugenics preached by Galton, he would be seen as a positive eugenicist. This would not be the case with the American eugenicists, who promoted their ideas on the back of the neo-Mendelian model. Galton and his successor Carl Pearson used biometrics to gauge how fit an individual was. In anachronistic terms, this meant that they believed that the outward appearance of the individual could tell you heaps about that individual and how biologically fit they were. Although they didn't know it, at least not in the early 1900s, they were looking at the phenotypical expression of a genotype. American eugenicists like Charles Davenport, particularly Charles Davenport, were not really interested in phenotypes. No, they were worried, concerned, actually terrified about the underlying genotype, or germplasm as Davenport called it, of the individual. These thoughts could not have been thunk without Mendelianism, the laws of which had been rediscovered in the 1890s. But to recap, the Mendelian insistence upon dominant and recessive genes meant that some attributes of an individual's genotype, including those that were thought to determine deviant behaviour like alcoholism, crime, or sexual depravity, might not be expressed phenotypically. In other words, you could be carrying genes for these abhorrent behaviours but not express them. However, you could pass them on to subsequent generations. This meant that not only was social deviance reduced to biological imperatives, but also that deviance could be hidden. So vast reservoirs of seemingly healthy people could be carrying deleterious genes that threatened the health of the entire population. At the same time, many of these characteristics were passed on and did express, which meant that they were identifiable, not through the analysis of DNA, such a thing was impossible, but through the judicious use of genealogy. It was this technique that was used by Henry Goddard in his study of the Kallikak family. Here he was able to identify generations of alcoholics and criminals, individuals weighed down by the burden of an unhealthy germplasm. He called them the Kallikaks, giving them a pseudonym that combined two ancient Greek words, kalos beautiful with kak bad. The dichotomy was part of the genealogical story. Goddard started with Deborah, who was an inmate of his New Jersey home for the care and education of the feeble-minded. Tracing back Deborah through the generations, he found that she was descended from a soldier from the Revolutionary Wars who had made a very respectable marriage. All the descendants from that marriage were sound, but Goddard also found as well that the soldier had had an affair. Bastards were issued, and the descent of those bastards was one long line of criminals, alcoholics, and feeble-minded girls like Deborah. Now, Deborah at her sewing machine might look to us like a good-looking girl hard at work, but Goddard was able to identify her as genetically feeble-minded and therefore a danger to the race. Quite right, she should be incarcerated in his institution. It was the Deborahs of the world that were most dangerous because they looked normal. And yet, in the view of the Goddards of the world, she carried the seeds in her germplasm of race suicide. Again, I make no apologies for the scare quotes. One suspects that Galton might have been quite keen on aspects of Goddard's work, in particular his use of psychometric testing, in other words IQ tests, to demonstrate levels of genetic fitness. He was able, that's Goddard, to develop a hierarchy of subnormal intelligence, the words of which remain, albeit quaintly, insults in our own times: feeble-minded, moron, imbecile, and you idiot. Deborah and this girl, somewhat comely but awfully dumb, were feeble-minded. In some regards, this was the most dangerous category. The IQ range was 99 down to 71, and of course, those at the higher end of the spectrum, perhaps the Deborahs and the comely girls of this world, could not necessarily be identified as subnormal. Below Deborah, it became much easier. Morons, the next rung down the ladder of degeneration, 70 descending to 51, were all too easy to spot, while the imbecile was obvious, 50 to 26, while the idiot had virtually lost contact with the world and probably posed little danger to the race. Except that both the Deborahs and the normals, through poor marriages, might end up reproducing, and their ill-fated little bundles of joy, or even the little bundles of joy's joy, would express the maleficent genes, thus threatening the health of the entire Caucasian race. Goddard was a geneticist through and through, and his work was deeply influential both within the psych sciences and wider society as a whole. Much the same could be said about Charles Davenport, the man who first headed up the Cold Spring Harbor Research Institute. Cold Spring Harbor was founded in 1910 with the aid of a grant from the robber baron Andrew Carnegie. It still exists to this day as a genetic research institute, and to be fair, it's very open about its eugenic past. Indeed, its website contains a plethora of interesting and useful material. I urge you to go and have a look at it. In Andrew Marr's documentary, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, one of the planks of his argument is the way that Darwinism influenced eugenics. Prime witness for his thesis was Davenport. But in many ways, Marr could not have been more wrong, because if Davenport had ever been interested in Darwin, that interest had receded into the background before he took up his position at Cold Spring Harbor. For Davenport was a thoroughgoing geneticist, whose research seemed to confirm the story told by Goddard, and who then attempted to develop a secular eugenics religion on the back of his views about biological fitness and reproduction. In developing the research program at the Institute, the concerns that had motivated Goddard to identify the genetic basis of deviance came fully to the fore. In this project, a number of deviances were identified which allied with the social and biological. The criminal, the pervert, the madman or madwoman or epileptic, the alcoholic were all products of faulty germplasm. For Davenport, social action was necessary to prevent the infection of the healthy by the hidden reservoirs of deviance lying in the germplasm of huge numbers of Americans, but particularly immigrants in a country that was expanding on the basis of immigration. It was for this reason that Davenport developed his own version of the Nicene Creed, which he implored Americans to sign up to. Here it is in all its glory, with its emphasis on breeding for the sake of the future health of the race. And, in this at least, Galton too would have improved, with its emphasis upon decisions made freely by the individual. But running counter to the laissez-faire ideology at the heart of social Darwinism, the eugenics program, propounded by Davenport and men and women of similar cast of mind, would refocus upon the state in its socio-political sense as government, law and bureaucracy combined, and the actions it could take to prevent the onset of atavism and barbarism that they believed would be the result of unfettered and unmonitored breeding. Davenport, however, had possessed ideas that came straight out of the Darwinian tradition, specifically the analogy between domestic breeding of animals and the lesson that the human race should learn from the pigeon fancier or the dog or horse breeder. We could possibly call it the racehorse analogy. I've had this one run past me by people that should know better. As many of you will know, and anyone who participates in the Melbourne ritual of Spring Carnival should know, in racing circles the line of descent of any horse is critical. That's why when a champion stallion or mare retires, off it goes to stud to reproduce and reproduce. The offspring of these controlled matings fetch millions of dollars on the back of the promise of future track success. And here we have Davenport suggesting that human breeding should occur on the same plane. Now, anyone that has got close to a racehorse knows what skittery, dangerous creatures they are. Far from mentally stable, they're metaphorically branded with the warning, handle with extreme care. Why anyone would want to make this analogy then is a mystery. And certainly today, geneticists won't have a bar of it. For them, the healthiest horse, like the healthiest dog, has none of the unhealthy pedigree of the thoroughbred. We live in times, thankfully, where science says mongrel is best. But clearly, Davenport equated the power of the thoroughbred with the potential success of a super race built upon eugenic intervention. This is not to say that Davenport was an out-and-out believer in the imposition of eugenic laws on a population. He did see a place for positive eugenics, as did all of the proponents of the eugenics movement in the USA, which is why a whole range of initiatives were introduced to encourage the fit to breed. I often think that the origins of Miss World or Miss Universe, the beauty pageant that feminists, I believe rightly, deride as objectifying and demeaning, lie in the eugenics beauty contest that attempted to use the outward phylogenetic appearance to determine fitness. Hence, beautiful baby contests and fitter families for Georgia, all designed to encourage effective breeding practices. Positive eugenics tried to apply biology to individual ethical decisions. In fact, it made marriage and reproduction a deeply bioethical issue. It was an early form of biopower that attempted to shape the subjectivity of the individual. Take contraception. It could be good or bad. With people who shouldn't breed, contraception was a humane solution to issues of natural human desire. But if the wrong people, the biologically fit, were using it, then it became dysgenic, a drag upon the development of the human race, because the people who should be breeding weren't having enough children. It is as well to remember that Mari Stopes, the founder of clinics to provide reproductive advice and contraception to women, was partly motivated by eugenic concerns. Eugenics could develop extreme biopolitical positions that undercut women's agency and attempted to undermine the growing feminist movement. Romantic love could be reconfigured as a selfish act that could lead to racial atavism. Feminism, with its insistence upon the woman's equality and the woman's right to make choices about love and reproduction, could be recast as a form of race suicide. The fit woman's place in this sphere of things was to make babies and bring them up right. Thus, suffragettes, for example, could potentially reverse human evolution with their radicalism. But in the land of the free and the home of the brave, the feeble-minded were about to be cast out of the polity and subjected to measures that were to be a harbinger of what was going to happen in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, the words spoken here by Davenport could have been translated into German, and with a bit of spitting and shouting, with super-added hand-waving, put into the script of a Hitler Nuremberg speech. Indeed, it is a reproach to our intelligence that we as a people, proud in other respects of our control of nature, should have to support about 500,000 insane, feeble-minded, epileptic, blind and deaf, 80,000 prisoners and 100,000 paupers at a cost of over $100 million per day. Join the dots. Biological inheritance not only causes these social problems, do note epilepsy's inclusion here and think on it, but potentially puts your taxes up because inevitably the state has to pick up the tab. So why not introduce measures that would prevent this wastage by stopping the deviants from being born at all? The solution was compulsory sterilisation of the unfit, who in this instance seemed to be the mentally ill, who were the easiest of targets. Alcoholics could demonstrably come from all classes, while some criminals were obviously just struggling, and therefore the insane bore the brunt of negative eugenics. Indiana was one of the first of many states to bring in compulsory sterilisation laws, but most celebrated of all was the Buck versus Bell case, where Carrie Buck was forcibly sterilised on the back of the ruling by Oliver Wendell Holmes that insisted 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. As it turned out, Buck was very far from being an imbecile in Goddard's terms, and seems to have been on the sharp end of some very nasty family politics. But nevertheless, there it is, in black and white, propounded by a Civil War veteran, who at one time had numbered one of the great humanist philosophers of his time or any, William James, as a friend. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. At this point, I want to make it clear that I'm not just singling out the USA. It is just the best case study. The fact is that Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands and France all had sterilisation laws. The fact that Australia and Britain did not is probably a result of the liberal democratic insistence upon the sovereignty of the subject and its enshrinement in a legal system that would have no truck with governments making these decisions. Or maybe we just got lucky, because there were plenty of people who wanted these measures brought in. And as Ross Jones has pointed out, in the Victorian context, that's here, education policy was formulated along eugenic lines. Let's finish with the case study of the black stork. I can only find a Spanish video that has obviously been taken from some American doco about Dr. Harry J. Hazelden and his eugenic beliefs. Hazelden thought, and put these thoughts into practice, that defective babies should be killed at birth. In the clip that follows, he's the star of his own film. And this film toured the flea pits of the USA for over 20 years, providing eugenic lessons at Saturday matinees that encouraged the view that all life was not equally worthy of life. I'll leave this as a final bridge to the Nazis. It requires little commentary in and of itself.
In the lead role, a physician, his profession in real life as well, Dr. Harry Hazelden, and a deformed baby. Dr. Hazelden spreads the gospel of eugenics in his own way. By refusing life-saving operations on deformed infants, or by making the operation fatal, he campaigns for his ideas. Dr. Hazelden's eugenics crusade makes him the star of his own movie. The climactic scene. Hazelden refuses the child a warming blanket. Dr. Hazelden's campaign aims at liberating America from defective heritage. If man could be induced to fall in love intelligently, if human matings could be placed upon the same level as horse breeding, the most progressive revolution in history.
So concluding, we're left with a number of issues. Clearly a lot spun out from Darwinism. Initially, eugenics was influenced, indeed inspired by his ideas. But eugenics takes a huge impetus from Mendelianism, far more than it does from Darwinism. And then there is the wider issue of the relationship between eugenics and social Darwinism. Well, what do you think? And can you see the differences between the two? And do the differences matter when in retrospect we conflate them? And finally, there is the ethical issue of whether Darwin should be held responsible for the use of his ideas by the social Darwinians or the eugenicists, a belief that the left-leaning Low Anthem and the right-wing Christian fundamentalists appear to share. I'm not going to answer these questions here. This is for you to think about and us to discuss in the workshops.